Today is July 17th, 2024. My guest is economist Noah Smith. He writes at Substack at No Opinion, NOAHPINION, No Opinion. This is Noah's fourth appearance on EconTalk. It was last here in January of 2024, discussing whether a nation can plunder its way to wealth. Our topic for today is poverty, what Noah calls in his essay at No Opinion on this topic, the elemental foe. Noah, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hey, great to be back.
Why do you call it the elemental foe? It's kind of grand, and I don't think it deserves that grandeur, but just why'd you use that wording?
That phrase comes from the Dr. Frankenstein. The titular character, Dr. Frankenstein, is on an expedition, I believe, to the Arctic. And he writes about data that he's going to get that will help humanity against the elemental foes of our race. And he means the elements themselves, He's talking about cold. How can people better survive the cold? And the idea is that humans are born into a universe where the elements themselves are against us. Poverty is the elemental foe, but not just because it's the fundamental or basic foe, but because the universe itself is always trying to kill us with rocks from space and diseases and just hunger that reappears every few hours.
Yeah, it's an interesting, thought-provoking observation that we're all able to absorb. Early on in the essay, you say the following, quote, "To ask why some societies in the world are still poor is the wrong question. Poverty is the default condition, not just of humanity, but of the entire universe. If humanity simply doesn't build anything, farms, granaries, houses, water treatment systems, electric power stations, we will exist at the level of wild animals. This is simply physics." I think that's undeniable, but you, with that stark language, make it very clear what our challenge is as human beings living on a rock.
Yeah, that's our condition in the world, right? Like if you look at the planets out there in the solar system, Mars or whatever, they're just sterile, right? Life is rare, and even on Earth, life is when life exists, most of it exists at a level of just absolute poverty. Animals always on the verge of starvation or predation. That's the only way that animal populations get controlled. And then when you look at human history, for most of human history, essentially everybody was living in grinding poverty. Even I guess it's kind of a cliche to point out, but even kings, kings had enough to eat and they had servants and do stuff for them. But at the same time, because of lack of modern technology, they were still carried away by disease all the time, and they were still probably malnourished, honestly, subject to heavy disease burden as kids that stunted their intelligence and physical health. A regular American is better off than a king of yesteryear, even if they have less servants.
Yeah,
right. And so
we have servants that aren't human, that work often much more effectively than the physical servants of the past, say cleaning clothes,
right.
washing dishes, and the many things we've automated.
That's true. And so the default state for much of the world, history, all of life is poverty. There's only a tiny little bit of non-poverty in the universe. We live in the tiny little pocket of non-poverty in the universe. Everywhere else is just constantly just on the verge of death. Everywhere else.
I never thought about it. The lion is king of the jungle, but the lion's standard of living is subsistence. If you find a nice herd, you might have a good day. You might even have a good couple of days, but you can't rise above the minimum with any success, right? Because you have no technology. And of course, as we'll talk about, what makes human beings able to imagine and then experience a standard of living that is well above subsistence requires going well beyond our natural gifts of being able to walk upright, having an opposable thumb. These are all nice things in a brain, but if you don't have tools and those tools don't improve, you stagnate. And most of human history, as I once heard George Will say it, most of human history is a man, if lucky, a man standing behind a horse, walking behind the horse, looking at the horse's rear while it pulls a plow. That's good times. But
Yeah.
and for most of human history, that's as good as it got. And that meant
You've seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, right?
Absolutely.
I think the most, the best line about economic development and economic history ever uttered is uttered in that movie, where someone says, "How do you know he's the king?" And someone else says, "He hasn't got shit all over him."
Yeah, that's a blunt way to describe pre-industrial life. It's a good point, and ate off better dishes than the rest of us, of course, as well. And had more to eat, but it was limited. The castle was bigger than the hovel, but the castle was cold, except in those handful of rooms where they would have a fire burning in that area.
Then it's smoky.
What?
Then it's smoky. You didn't have a thermostat. We live like the kings of yesteryear. I mean, we have jobs, we've got to work, but I guess, kings officially had jobs and had to work too. A lot of kings worked really hard. We don't always have people always trying to kill us for our inheritance.
Yeah.
It's like people, the reason you have Game of Thrones type situations with people trying to kill the king all the time is because you're competing for like the one non-poverty position in society.
Yeah, which is why uneasy lies the head that wears the crown. Hope I have that right, Shakespeare, but I often misquote it unintentionally. But that's clearly the downside that standard of living brought with it, which is that other people envied it, sought it, and often would kill for it, or at least scheme for it. And we are fortunate to have that standard of living living in many of us, not all, but many of us are able to live in uniformly warm in the winter rooms or uniformly cool rooms in the summer without the threat of being usurped that the king had to face to have that standard of living in, say, the Middle Ages.
Yeah. Exactly.
So let's talk about the role of technology. And of course, there's a lot to say here, but I like you have an interesting phrase of how we keep away poverty in the modern world. Your answer is industrial modernity. It's never going to be I think, refrain of a romantic song about economic development, but it captures in a very short, pithy phrase what it is that sustains our standard of living. We'll add a few things as well, but let's start with that phrase, industrial modernity. What do you mean by it?
Industrial modernity is a system of technological edifices. Technology itself is the knowledge of how to do a thing, right? You can have embodied technology, which is like a thing itself, but industrial society is a bunch of technological systems. So, for example, roads, the road system. We know how to make roads. We have a bunch of roads. The roads go to a lot of places. You can drive on one road, you can get off onto the other road, and then get to where you're going. That's an example. Let's see, the agricultural distribution centers. We have all these big buildings full of food. And from those buildings, mostly trucks take the food to like stores where you can get the food, or to places where we give away food for free to poor people, but then mostly to stores where people will buy the food. And then that's pretty amazing. That network which includes a lot of logistics and spreadsheets and stuff, but also includes the roads, it includes the trucks, it includes the the farms themselves. All these technological edifices are really impressive. These are automated farms. They have big machines driving through a field. Just planting, harvesting, and tending just massive amounts of crops, and that's part of industrial modernity. You have railroads, you have water treatment plants, you have tap water, you have hospitals, you have other medical clinics and primary care clinics and things like that. You have the internet, you have the telephone network and those things like that. You have the electrical grid that gives you power to light your house, heat your house, gas pipelines, mines, and warehouses for all kinds of manufactured goods, huge factories full of machine tools. These things are industrial modernity. All of these technological edifices together are what keep us in that little non-poverty bubble of the universe.
I want to add two things to that. One, of course, is Adam Smith's division of labor observation that we specialize in the modern world. We don't do everything for ourselves. We rely on others through this web of transactions that you've sketched out. The other thing I would mention that is remarkable about that is that the processes that you're describing in very briefly, they're a remarkable transformation over time of relentlessly reducing the amount of human labor necessary to produce those things. And if you think about that for a minute, which would be, you'll be wrong, but if you think about it for a minute, you might think, well, that can't be good. I mean, you're getting rid of all these jobs, and 1900, 40% of Americans worked on the farm, and they got replaced by bigger and bigger farms using, as Adam Smith pointed out, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. As the world grew and that transportation system expanded that you talked about with trucks and trains, the farms got bigger. The machinery then that you could use effectively on those farms got viable and then bigger. And fewer people were needed to work on farms to make an immensely larger amount of food, such that by modern times, about 2% of the American workforce is in agriculture. And that, to a farmer of 1900, would be a frightening thought. Oh my gosh, all those jobs are going to be lost. And that's happening everywhere in the country. One of my old favorite examples, haven't talked about in ages, is chickens. Is chickens and egg production. Egg production is a massive technological project. It used to be you had some chickens in your backyard, you tossed out some feed in the morning, and you see if they laid any eggs. Now, one or two people take care of, I think it's about 100,000 chickens. I haven't looked at that data in a while, but an enormous number of chickens because technology is able to take care of all the tasks that were done before by human beings. And the joke, of course, is that in a modern factory, there's two employees. There's the dog and the worker. And the worker's job is to feed the dog. And the dog's job is to make sure the worker doesn't interfere with the technology that's going on all around that's producing whatever it is, whether it's eggs, pencils, shirts, shoes, all over the world, of course, not just in the United States. But that industrial modernity is relentlessly focused on reducing the amount of labor that's involved in producing more and more goods. Less for more, getting more from less is the mantra of economic development, and it's magical.
So one interesting thing about that is there's a couple interesting things. One is that there's a theory that driving up the cost of labor accelerates this process. And when you suddenly have a big flood of cheap labor, it might actually slow the process of technology. And some people argue that when China came into the World Trade Organization in 2001, we started offshoring a bunch of labor-intensive things to China. Nowadays, we don't do that anymore. But back then, in the 2000s, we did. When we offshored a bunch of stuff of manufacturing to China, which at that time was a very labor-intensive economy, some people think that that might have slowed down the progress of automation because we essentially, according to this telling, replaced robots with cheap Chinese labor.
Yeah, for sure.
And so industrial modernity doesn't, it seeks to economize, but it doesn't always economize via automation. And some people argue, what's interesting is that the first steam engine was a toy on the desk of a Greek guy living in the Roman Empire. He had a little steam engine on the desk. He called it the Aleopile. And, it could spin around with steam. You could have used that to create the Industrial Revolution in Rome. There were some things that they didn't have. It would have been a little bit harder. Glass, for example. They didn't have as good glass back in Rome. They had glass, but I think they invented glass actually. But they didn't have great glass like they did, in 1600 Europe or whatever. But they had a lot of stuff, and the basic idea of the steam engine was there. There's an argument that cheap labor in Rome, due to the persistence of slavery, prevented people from economizing on labor by automating, by looking for machines. Whereas this is Robert Allen, the economist Robert Allen argues this, and he said that the reason the Industrial Revolution took off in Britain was very expensive labor, because so many workers had left for the Americas, or there were laws driving up labor costs, various reasons. Well, wages, according to Allen, people dispute this. Economic historians look for different data sources and they argue back and forth. But he says that because there were factors making the price of labor so high in Britain, it forced people to go looking for like James Watt's steam engine as an alternative. And that process of automation built and built and built. And, once you figured out the steam engine, oh, wow, we can use the steam engines to clear these mines. Oh, well, look, we can use them to move stuff on a railroad. And so, innovation bred innovation. And the question of why the Industrial Revolution didn't start for so long is a question that should haunt us. Because there were, reasonably free markets in many states. It was not a case of there was no world government. There were certainly regimes that had reasonably free markets. A lot of the technologies, a lot of the basic technologies probably could have been invented in Rome, in Sung Dynasty China and Ming Dynasty China. And a lot of these old places, and they weren't. We did not get an Industrial Revolution. We didn't get a takeoff. And that question haunts me, and it should haunt every person who thinks about economics, because it lasted so many thousands of years. It was over 1,000 years from when Rome could have done an Industrial Revolution to when the Industrial Revolution actually happened. And that's kind of scary.
Yeah, or sad, or not. We're going to talk. We'll talk a little bit in a minute about the non-economic aspects of this, or the non-financial, non-material aspects of it would be a better word. But my answer is not a very imaginative one for why it took so long, which is Adam Smith's about the extent of the market. So if you're going to, I'll put a link up to an essay I wrote on this. If you're going to make 3 sandwiches a day, you cut the meat, and they're meat sandwiches. You cut the meat with a knife, and you bake the bread in your oven, and you slice the sandwiches in half with that knife, and maybe you wrap them up in something, and you give them to your 3 friends who you're going on a fishing trip with or a hunting expedition. But if you're making 10,000 sandwiches, you have a meat slicer, and you don't use a knife, and you don't use your home oven. You build a massive oven that can much more efficiently and cheaply per sandwich bake the bread. But it would be not absurd, wasteful, too expensive if you're making 3 sandwiches to buy an industrial oven and a giant meat slicer and so on. Now, if you have a chance to sell, if you start making 3 and you realize, wow, it's really time intensive to make 3 sandwiches, but if I made 10,000, it could be really cheap. And then I could maybe sell most of those 10,000 to people because the price will be so much lower than it would be for them to make them themselves. But if you can't distribute it and the roads aren't very good and there's no way your village only has a few dozen people in it, you're not going to it'll never be viable to use that level of capital that a modern industrial process uses. So it's a bit of a just so story, obviously, and I don't want to suggest that, when transportation improved and people got more connected and the world got effectively smaller, that then people said, let's invent some stuff to take advantage of this. I don't think that's, literally what happened. I think what happened is all these things proceeded together in not in lockstep, but in missteps and going too many steps and eventually getting things right. But I do think that the idea of doing something extraordinary when the world you inhabit is small economically, financially, materially, is not surprising. So that's my first thought on that topic.
Yeah, I'm probably right.
Well, that's simple. Okay, well, let's move on. I think you're going to think some more about it, Noah, but I appreciate the kind words. You mentioned one of my favorite themes. You call them fantasies of an imagined past. And this is what I think of as the romanticization of poverty, that human beings in ancient times avoided the alienation of industrial modernity by living simpler lives, making more things for themselves, being closer to nature, and so on. But you call that a fantasy. Why?
Because I think that I actually don't understand the psychology behind this nostalgia. I think people, it's not nostalgia for a place you were. There's this nostalgia of, I want the world to be like it was when I was a kid because being a kid is great. And so I remember the world being so great, right? Like everyone was kind of poorer in the 1990s than now, or at least the 1980s. But I was just raring to go, just eating, like crappy food, but I loved it. I was just playing outside with a little red wagon. I don't know, it was great. I understand that kind of nostalgia. But the kind of nostalgia where people will look at like an advertisement from the 1950s and decide, okay, that's how it really was. Everybody was flying on these luxurious planes where you could just, everyone was flying first class and people would just bring you drinks, and everyone had this giant yard where you were always having barbecues, and, everyone was very pretty and immaculate, and you could do all that on just one income from just having one husband, working at a factory job. You could support all of that, and all the kids could go to college, and everybody had cars and, big lawns, and that was so great. And then, I don't know, nobody played loud music and nobody cheated on their spouse. And I don't know. It's a fantasy. It was created. Those things were created. Those pictures, those images from the 50s that we have are not real. They are not what the 50s really were like, right? They were things they were marketing images, advertising that was created by talented fantasists of the day to get people, the middle class, to buy more stuff, and in that they did their job. I'm not criticizing the advertisers and the marketers here. I'm criticizing people who mistake that for reality, because reality was that rivers in major cities caught fire because of the pollution. The reality was that houses for a middle-class family were half the size they were today. The reality is that if people even had a TV, it would be a small black and white TV, one small black and white TV in one room that was kind of crappy and had a bunch of programs on it that you wouldn't even watch today. And people lived in these cities where, coal smoke hung like a pall. Like if you look at Pittsburgh, it looked like, it looked like, Beijing in like 2006. Like Pittsburgh just looked like Mordor, and the level of poverty was just much larger than what we're used to now. There were still, like most people weren't living in those capacious houses in those nice manicured suburbs. And the ones who did, like if you go to like not a poor, but a working class neighborhood in Los Angeles today, and you see, first generation immigrants from Honduras living in some like, far flung suburb of Los Angeles, and like, working at like a, CVS or something. That is a bit better. They live a bit better than your middle class family in the 50s that are the subjects of those advertisements. And if you went back to the 50s, you'd be like, okay, everybody's poor. You'd think that because I don't know why people think that. And that's not, but thinking the 50s were economic paradise isn't even the craziest thing. People think the Middle Ages were economic paradise. There are these people who say, oh, peasants actually didn't spend their time working. They were indolent peasants. I can I can show you indolent peasants in an agricultural village in, Nigeria or some parts of India. I can do that. We can go. We can see indolent peasants. They're sitting there starving. They're sitting there with nothing to do. Yes, they're indolent, but there's tons of work to do. You could tidy up the house. You could build a better house. You could do all kinds of things. You could be gainfully employed. There's nothing to do, and you don't have the energy because you don't have enough food. So you don't have the energy to get up off your ass and work because you don't have enough calories. And so all you can do is sit there and be kind of, or you're medically disabled or something like that. So you can't even fix up your house and make it look nice or go find some work to afford extra stuff. Like, it's not just people kicking back, and like, oh yeah, we have this, we in the agricultural age, we created negative stereotypes of people who are layabouts and don't work, right? They're just enjoying their life, blah, blah, blah. The reality is that a lot of people were, disabled, sick, hungry, or old, weak, and they were trying to extract labor from them by saying, get up and work, you lazy ass. But, like, there was not necessarily work to do. Like, if the crops aren't coming in, if you only have a little garden out in the middle of, crappy soil, there's no farming to be done. And yet, just get some more land. Where? No, someone else has the other land. The farms are all overcrowded. If people don't have work, if peasants don't have work in poor subsistence farming areas, as sometimes they don't, it's because it's either because they can't work or because the farms are too crowded. There's nothing to farm. So, you're just desperately poor. You would like to work. And so this is why when you start the process of industrialization, everybody moves from the farms to the cities. People trade their so-called indolent medieval type lifestyle as a peasant for, 14-hour days of backbreaking work in some smoky sweatshop. They trade that eagerly, and they don't, very few of them go back. And yes, it sucks to work in a sweatshop, but like, it really sucks to be an agricultural peasant. Like, peasant is just about the only thing worse than sweatshop, or I guess getting killed in a war or something. But like, the number of farmer suicides in India is off the charts. They're like, surrounded by enveloping warmth of community and collective society in village life, people don't have the psychological disorders and depression of the modern age. And so you don't see suicide. Yes, you do. And people kill themselves constantly in rural areas. Peasants are just offing themselves in droves because poverty sucks.
Well, I thought, you've gone from the 1950s to the Middle Ages, but of course, many people want to go back further and go to the hunter-gatherers that people
Right.
romanticize, where, you spend a few hours a day You might catch yourself a deer, and then the rest of the time you're reciting Homer, which you've memorized because you don't have any books, but the oral tradition has passed it along, and or you're playing a flute you've carved for yourself from a nearby tree. That vision is probably a fantasy, an illusion. Ancient primitive people spend most of their day looking for protein and struggling to find it because life is hard without modernity.
Right? Exactly. It is a constant, desperate struggle for survival, also extremely violent. Like, it's more violent to be a hunter-gatherer than to be a peasant. And even being a peasant's pretty violent. So like we can go see hunter-gatherers. Of course, all the pastoralists, the people who believe that the hunter-gatherers had it great, they say, oh, well, the hunter-gatherers that you see today in Papua New Guinea or the Amazon, those people aren't like the hunter-gatherers of yore because they've been pressured by capitalism and modernity, and their resources have shrunk. Bullshit. We have archaeology. We know that the hunter-gatherers of the past lived pretty much like the hunter-gatherers today. They were just, more of humanity was subject to that crap. And, it sucked. Like, it's, I don't know, maybe we should blame JRR Tolkien. But no, you shouldn't blame Tolkien any more than you blame the 1950s advertisers. Tolkien created fantasies of elves, right? We don't have to, if we choose to believe or allow ourselves to believe that hunter-gatherers were Tolkien elves, that's not Tolkien, that's on us. That's our mistake. That's us not being able to tell fantasy from reality. I have, many weaknesses and flaws as a person, but I think that one of my strengths has always been that I'm pretty damn good at recognizing fantasy.
It's an important skill. I want to mention a show. I don't know if you saw it, but I loved it, and we haven't talked about it for, I don't know, maybe a decade on the program, called Frontier House. It's a PBS reality show. They put a group of contestants. I was like, in my memory, it's 5 or 6 families, and they put them in rural Canada.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was rural Canada. And the rules of the game are that you have to live with the technology of the 1880s.
Uh-huh.
And
I love this.
And so it's frontier, and there's humor because some of the teenagers in the show smuggle in makeup or toilet paper or other things they're not supposed to. But that's the occasional diversion on the show. But most of the show is semi-serious. It's very serious, actually. And by the way, the goal is really simple. It's to get through the winter, and each family is given. They live near each other, and they're given a little bit of an asset.
Show? Like,
I'm going to get to that.
I'm
going to get to that.
This show is not ethical. IRB. We need IRB on this.
Hang on. So each person gets each family gets a little bit of an asset. Like one family gets a cow, and somebody else gets a roofed place, and et cetera. And the only cheating, in quotes, that's allowed is for medical reasons. So if you're allowed to have access to modern health, modern medicine, and I would add dentistry. I assume if someone needed a root canal, I don't think anybody did in the short period that the show existed, but a root canal without anesthesia or painkiller would be very, very unpleasant.
I don't think they give you a root canal. I think they ripped out your tooth. Yeah,
that's also no fun. So the humor, it's dark, but the tragicomic thing that happens, 2 things happen that are worth summarizing the experience. One is that after a few months of the show, one of the men panics because he thinks he's dying, and he asks to see the doctor, and they bring in the modern doctor, and the doctor says, "You're one of the fittest people I've ever met," because he's been hauling water, and doing other horrible, challenging, physically demanding tasks of 1880 life. And he says, you've just lost 40 pounds or whatever it is and replaced it with muscle. And basically the guy would look at himself and his wife would look at him and thinks like, you look horrible. What's going wrong with you? And the answer is he looked like a coal miner of 1880 or a farmer because he was so fit, thin, muscular, lean. He wasn't lifting weights, but he was a specimen that we don't see much of in the modern world because we're more indolent. Anyway, that's the first thing. The second thing that happened that's fantastic is they ended the show before the winter because none of them would have made it. You know, the whole idea was to build up enough food and other resources so you could get through the winter. And they basically, had to stop the show mid-season. I don't know, was it mid-season or not? It had a lot of episodes. But anyway, I recommend it to listeners. It involves
What's the show called?
It's called Frontier House. I'm sure you can get it on a DVD,
right,
but you might even be able to watch it online. Came with some
you know,
economics. You can get economics lessons from it. There was a parallel version in London of, I can't remember what it was called. It was also it was a little bit of Downton Abbey. It was kind of trying to capture what it was like to live it was not in a fancy house, but a house in a 19th century urban area. And the answer is it's different and it's really hard.
Do you know why they were going to die?
Well, they weren't going to have enough to eat. It's kind of,
yeah, you know why?
They'd be too cold.
I know exactly why.
Why?
Their family was too small.
Yeah, that
they
may
didn't
be.
have kids. The reason people have 7 kids, the reason pre-industrial fertility is 7 children per woman is because you need all those people to make a bunch of food. And you were talking about specialization before. You specialize within the household.
Sure.
In the homestead, you have one person who's just cooking and doing house stuff all day, and the other person is just dressing meat all day. Basically, plowing the field, whatever you do. You have somebody doing it all day, and then you specialize within the household, and people work from age 9, or earlier, right? Little kids are running around doing errands constantly. As soon as you can talk, you start working. Child labor is the universal norm.
So Homer, but you don't know what it means because there's no real education other than the rudiments of animal husbandry and the what's needed on the farm. Obviously, there's quite a bit of education. It's just not what we would call modern book learning. Let's shift to a topic you write about in passing, but I want to spend a little more time on it here, which is the degrowth movement. It's another form of romance. What's the idea of that? What are people selling, and what do you think of it?
Well, degrowth. It's primarily a European movement, and I would say more British and North European than elsewhere. There's various manifestations of it, but basically, they say GDP is a bad indicator of human flourishing. We need to be happy instead of make GDP go up. And then, we're destroying the environment with industrial society and technology. So we need to degrow. We need to, because the ideology of rampant growth is just what keeps us destroying the environment. Instead, if we stopped growth, then the environment would be saved. And it's all complete hogwash.
I assume you don't disagree with the claim that GDP is a flawed measure of human flourishing. I think it is a flawed measure. I would agree with that starting point. I just wouldn't necessarily go to the next chapter.
I would say that when the poorer you get, the poorer a country is, the more GDP is everything. That when you look at poor countries, GDP is just incredibly tightly correlated with life expectancy and nutrition levels and education levels and all these things. Everything else you can measure and quantify is incredibly highly correlated with GDP. Now, when you get to be a rich country, some of those things start breaking down. Some of those correlations start breaking down. Not completely. There still is a correlation. It's just a lot less tight. So a lot of things aren't counted in GDP. So when you get all the, houses and the cars and the medical supply, and, medical care and all the other material stuff, you have some countries that just don't do very well at, say, preventing crime, or public health, having people not be fat in the first place, or various other things, nicely designed cities, cleanliness, things like that aren't measured in GDP. They're not marketized goods. You could pay someone to do some of these things, but typically don't, and so they're not recorded in GDP. So once you get to a rich country like America, GDP still matters somewhat, but it doesn't matter nearly as much. But when you're a poor country, if you are Bangladesh, GDP is absolutely everything. So I think it just depends on who you are. Like the idea that you'd want to forsake GDP in order to have like work-life balance or whatever in Bangladesh, no. Like Bangladeshis will not. Like maybe a tiny bit, but primarily they want to escape material poverty.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think, so GDP is great as a measure of development, not as amazing as a measure of success as a rich country.
Fair enough. Let's go back to the romance that we were making fun of a minute ago and try to take it a little more seriously. So while I understand the case for industrial modernity, I think it's true that things are lost in the pursuit of not escaping poverty, perhaps, and not escaping subsistence levels of standard of living, but somewhere between there and what a good chunk of a modern industrialized country has as a lifestyle. I think about our old conversations on this program about economic development and the joke that's not a joke, that the biggest way to fight poverty is luggage. Get away from the poor parts of the world where there are no opportunities for industrial modernity and join the web of interacting human beings called the modern economy, which is sustained mostly through forces that no one controls, the price system that Leonard Reed writes about in I, Pencil, or that Hayek writes about in The Use of Knowledge in Society. That uncontrolled emergent order, you want to be a part of it because then you're not going to starve to death. And if you're not a part of it, you're going to have a tough time. So that's your case. But certainly as you move away from, say, where you were born, or you move away from where your parents are or your siblings, and many Americans will forego living near home or living near siblings for economic opportunity or career advancement or flourishing in a different way. But something is lost. And I think that, Chris Arnott talks about the front row versus the back row in the classrooms where he grew up, where the front row got out of town because the economic opportunity in the Florida place he grew up in wasn't very great. So he pursued an advanced degree and flourished financially, but something was lost. And do you accept that, or do you think that's a different, just this kind of romance?
Wait, ask that last part again.
My claim is that in the pursuit of financial and material success, some of which is about the comforts of a certain lifestyle, and some of it is about self-expression through one's application of one's talents in the workforce, career development, whatever you want to call it. Something is lost. We're less connected to where we grew up. We're less connected to our parents. We're less connected in America. I'm talking about. I'm in Israel. Here in Israel, it's a physically small country, and those bonds are very, very strong between siblings, between parents, between grandparents, and grandchildren. And it's strikingly different from the way I lived in the United States, in the sense that people spend a lot of energy preserving those familial connections. I feel like in the United States, less focus on that. And I would suggest something is lost. I'm not saying we should subsidize families or subsidize staying at home or not moving, but there is something to the romance. Okay.
honestly, I think that Americans are pretty family oriented. I think that Americans are more family oriented than Japanese people. That's the other country where I've lived. That goes against some old stereotypes. And I'm sure that in the long past, Japan was very family oriented, but it changed. Corporations pulled apart the Japanese family, to a large degree. Um, I think people in villages, in less developed countries are more family oriented than Americans, but a lot of that is family as a work unit. Yes, you get the constant, like your family is your work team, and yeah, that affords you a social circle that's the case your entire life, but it traps you. People wanted to get away from that close family life. And I think we keep in touch with our families in America pretty well, and people, maintain relations with their family pretty well. But I think that to some degree, the constant, like, living your entire life with this small group of people that you didn't get to choose was stifling and trapping for a lot of people. It doesn't mean you don't love your family, but it means that if your family are the only people you spend your entire life with for your life, that can be a bit confining. And,
fair enough.
Yeah. So I think American, finding your way to a better balance between family and friends and, like your own family that you start with your own kids and whatnot, and people at work, coworkers. I think that, we're not doing too badly at that. I think we're doing better than Japan did. Where the corporations and their work cultures pulled, especially men, but now everybody, just away from their families and said your coworkers are the only people who matter to you. And kids would go weeks without seeing their dads. In 1990s Japan, weeks. Like, the dad would never come home. He'd commute and then sleep in a hotel in the city, or maybe come home briefly, catch a few hours of sleep, and then be gone in the morning. And husbands and wives completely estranged. Talk about multi-generational households. Well, yeah, you'd have that, but it was the wife taking care of the aged parents while the dad's nowhere to be seen. And then the wife has so much work to do doing elder care that she'll just, mom will just say, we'll just give the kids money and say, go run around the city. It's safe. Tokyo's safe. Osaka's safe. Japan's safe. So you just go run around the city with money, with cash. And what do? Well, they all got yeast infections because they didn't change their underwear because they were running around and had, no parents take care of them, these teenage girls. And so the Japanese government got this brilliant idea that they were going to put women's underwear vending machines around the city so that teenage girls who weren't going home to their parents and were just staying overnight at their friend's house or in some bar or wherever in the city could get underwear without having to go all the way back home to their suburban home. And so thus was born the legend of Japanese panty vending machines, which were actually a misguided attempt by the government of Japan to get clean underwear to teenagers who weren't going home because their parents didn't pay any attention to them ever.
Well, I can't comment on the veracity of this story.
Truth is stranger than fiction.
Or it's how general this problem was in Japan, but
it was a short-lived, aborted experiment. No one used the vending machines. A few of them were put up as a pilot program. They were taken out when no one used them. And eventually the government just invested in social services to have people track kids down via their phones, find out where they were, and make sure they were doing something. They were in school or with their parents or whatever. That's what happened. But the anecdote is meant to illustrate the fact that Japanese family society broke down in ways that American family society never really did.
Well, yeah. I don't mean to suggest that that America's at the bottom of the family tree or pole or whatever, but I think the claim I'm making is that when you have a desperately poor society, it's good for everyone to be part of a move toward industrial modernity.
Yeah.
When you live in, which I take as your main point, but when you live in an industrial modern society already, one has to face the trade-offs of lifestyle and whatever you want to call it, work-life balance. I don't like that phrase, actually. I'm not sure why, but it simplifies something. I think it's much deeper is probably why I don't like it.
Mm-hmm.
You have to decide what you care about. And that's a personal choice. I don't think the government should make it for you, or we should push people in certain directions. All I'm suggesting is that what underlies some of the romantic fantasies that you and I have been critiquing about primitive life, whether it's hunter-gatherers, the medieval peasant, the 1950s, underlying that is a thirst for something that is harder to find in modern life than it might otherwise be, which are these fundamental connections between kin and friends. Now, I take your point. You don't want to spend, I like the example of George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. He's the movie romanticizes Bedford Falls in a certain version of it. But a lot of people who grow up in the Bedford Falls of the world want to live in the big city. They don't want to live in the little tiny place where they see the same people every day. So it's a personal choice. For some people, it's more comforting than for others to see the same people every day and the same tradespeople and the same friends and so on. But I think my point's a simple one, that this move to industrial modernity, which is a fabulous one overall because it removes the threat of poverty and hunger, which hangs over all human beings, which you write so eloquently about, it comes at some kind of costs in various ways that a thoughtful person should be aware of in making choices about how to live within that modern world.
Yeah. I think what happened with modernity in terms of social changes is that we largely traded neighbors for coworkers and co-enthusiasts. I think we're trading what I call a horizontal community for vertical community. So in the old days, you'd know the people who live next door. Now I know a couple of people who live next door. And in fact, I have friends on my block. I have several friends who live very close to me, who come over to my house frequently. So I actually do, for the first time since college, I do have real proximate neighbors. But, when I lived in Japan, I only know maybe one neighbor. When I lived in New York, I didn't know any neighbors at all. When I lived in Michigan, I knew none of my neighbors. Growing up in College Station, Texas, I sort of knew my neighbors, but I never would talk to them. But your coworkers, and the people that you hike with or play Dungeons and Dragons with or pick up basketball, whatever you do, you're co-enthusiasts, right? And people online, and but your coworkers, right? And then you still know your family. Like I think that the changes in family life, except for some societies like Japan that have gotten some stuff wrong, the changes in family life have not been as dramatic as the changes in whether you organize horizontally or vertically. Vertically being like, according to what company you work for, what you're interested in, things like that. The verticals of society. We were trading, and now with the internet, that's gone into turbo mode, because with the internet, you can just stay holed up in your cave, building what you feel to be deep bonds with someone in Australia. It's not even like in the days of coworkers, you're still physically proximate. You were still physically proximate to the coworkers, right? In the case of co-enthusiasts, you'd still meet them on the basketball court. But now your co-enthusiasts are just people who write similar memes to you, and, and you have some notional connection with them online.
Yeah,
I wonder if something important's lost, but,
Yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to play out culturally over time. I don't know if we're going to keep this. I mean, I like I think I've seen you physically once. I think we've been in the same room once. Twice, okay, but not very often. A fraction of the number of times, half the number of times we've talked on Zoom via EconTalk. And yes. I think if we spent an evening getting drinks and dinner and going to listen to music, our relationship would be very different than a fifth EconTalk. It would just be richer. I'm still a big fan of in-person interaction.
I am too.
There's online interaction's nice. I mean, I love getting emails from you listeners out there. It makes me smile and swells makes my day. It's lovely to know that you're listening and paying attention, and this program has some impact on you that you share and you take the trouble to share. Just is wonderful. But it's not the same as in person, and which is fascinating to me. I mean, I can see you really well. The technology is great. There's a tiny lag, which is a big problem for banter and interjecting the noises and sounds that we use as human beings to interact effectively. But it's pretty good. It's worth something.
Yeah. It's So, but I don't want to be a Panglossian about technology and say that every single technology that ever exists makes us better. Makes our some technologies, if we had never invented them, stuff would be better. Certain military technologies that just kill a lot of people. Maybe.
Or maybe the smartphone. I mean, some people, the smartphone's going to be a really interesting thing over the next 20 years, 10 years, because when it first came out, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I thought so. I still love it. I'm addicted to it. And there are addictions that are not deadly. I don't think it's a deadly addiction. It's just a transformative addiction. And we've transformed ourselves and our interactions with each other through that, the ever-presence, the ubiquitous nature of the cell phone, ubiquity of the cell phone. So a lot of people are a little uncomfortable with that, and many aren't. And it's going to be interesting to see how norms and culture evolves in reaction to those reactions. I don't know. I used to assume there'd be a big backlash, and I don't see it yet. So it's a little backlash. Some places are banning phones
in classrooms
for children in classrooms. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
I want to close with a quote, and which I think helps tie some of what we've said together. Although it won't get to the vending machines. Although it might. You never know.
Well, you can cut the part about the vending machines if you want. I just like that. That's a good anecdote about family breakdown.
Yeah. So here's the quote. It's from your essay. Our intelligence has given us an opportunity not afforded to other animals, the chance to conceive of our species as a single team, fighting not individually, but as an army united against the implacable elemental foe of poverty and desolation. Close quote. That single team thing is a really cool, beautiful image. Most of us don't know we're on that team. And we don't get any satisfaction. What I liked about that paragraph or sentence actually, is that it adds some romance to industrial modernity. It says it's not this decentralized, alienating, dog-eat-dog world of corporate capitalism we're under the thumb of. We're actually cooperating, often unknowingly, in a rather extraordinary enterprise worth cherishing and honoring, which is not just surviving, but thriving materially, which allows us to do all kinds of things, live longer lives, travel and see parts of the world we otherwise wouldn't see. 1,000 things that make life lovely, and we choose which ones we want to have because we can. And we should use our intelligence not just to expand the scope and effectiveness of industrial modernity. We could use it to appreciate it.
Well, I think so. I would like us to appreciate it more, and I don't know how to get people to do that yet. I write for a living. I am pretty good at describing things to people and, arguing ideas and things like that. But in terms of how to get people to appreciate what they have, to some degree, maybe, I wrote this other essay called Toward a Shallower Future. Maybe people who are so ignorant of pain and want that they idly romanticize the hunter-gatherer existence or the Middle Ages or the 1950s. Maybe getting to the point where people are that entitled and so comfortable that they can afford to sit there making up these fantasies. Maybe that was the whole point. Maybe children notoriously have difficulty telling fantasy and reality. They live their lives swimming through like a little fantasy world that they partially make up themselves. And maybe the goal of human society should be to return us to that existence. Perhaps fantasy is the ultimate form of consumption. And, of course, at the same time, people who understand the danger of the elemental foe of poverty lurking right outside our castle walls, people who understand that danger, we have to, be the adults in the room. We have to remember that stuff like degrowth is stupid, and we have to remember the reality of what's out there. But maybe not everybody has to. Maybe the ultimate luxury, the ultimate escape from poverty is to not even remember that poverty is out there.
My guest today has been Noah Smith. You can read his essays at Noah Opinion on Substack. Noah, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me back.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.